20th century. And we'll start with a note about television. Go on to slide 2. So I have included some of the better movies, not these that you see listed on this slide, because video in general has such a strong impact on popular perceptions. And I want to help you, as one of my major goals in this course, I want to help you to parse fact from fiction in these videos, since the vast majority of people watch TV, watch videos, they don't read about history. In videos and movies about history, there's often a love story artificially injected into them, because that's what sells. After all, I think one of the subconscious things that everybody has in them is a desire to see the species continued, and love stories are, after all, partly about continuing the species. But anyway, it's what sells, and this is not limited to Hollywood. Even the ancient epic Ramayana, that's R-A-M-A-Y-A-N-A, the Ramayana, which originated in India, is a perfect example of an ancient story that infuses love into the narrative. It generally works more easily to have a main character from the author's culture, as we see here. The same is true when Chinese people, for example, write about faraway lands, hence the film A Beijinger in New York, which was very popular about 15 years ago and is still part of, sort of like a household word in China. But to wind this up, when educated Western people my age who have heard of the Tokugawa, which we're about to talk about, when they think about that, they are likely to conjure up this image from the TV version of the James Clavell novel Shogun. That TV version was made in the mid-1980s. The book came from the 1960s, and it was very well done, as were some of Clavell's other books about Asia, including King Rat, which was based on his time as a British POW, prisoner of war, in Changi Prison in Singapore during World War II. All good spring break or summer reading when you're done with this course. Going on, slide 3. So the Tokugawa, we will describe them in this hour. The baseline of development that was left by the Tokugawa had a strong effect on the Meiji, beginning in 1868, and the so-called Meiji Restoration, and afterwards. It is a legacy because, in spite of the Meiji reformist effort to erase and replace certain elements of the past, such as the role of the samurai, large portions of tradition and practice were carried forward. Respect for authority, a sense of duty, and disrespect for women, and disrespect for common people by the elites were among those things. Plus, the Tokugawa made some very rational efforts to reform their economy and their political system that ran up against popular suspicion and resentment of foreign powers. So these things all played into the Meiji Restoration, which is an important historical event in the history of East Asia, and therefore a major subject of this course. Go on to slide 4. So in 1800, there were 180 feudal lords, that's F-E-U-D-A-L, feudal lords, or daimyo. It's on this slide, so I'll stop spelling things, who ruled Japan at the local level. Some scholars, by the way, put that number higher. I've seen the number 260 before, but it's of no great consequence. There were some that were very small. There were others that were in their power. There were others that ruled large territories the sizes of present-day prefectures. Each of them had their own army. and they had an administrative capital around a castle, usually, the daimyo's castle. The daimyo performed fealty to the shogun, who was the most powerful of all of the military men that ruled Japan, and who was shogun because his side had won the armed struggle that had preceded that period. We'll get into that as we go. The daimyo each had to provide hostages to him in Edo, the shogun's capital, which is now called Tokyo. And these hostages were people like the heir apparent, the wife and concubines of the local daimyo. The shogun was the emperor's military lieutenant in formal terms, but in terms of real power, de facto power, the shogun was really the emperor's jailer. If you watch the recommended movie, The Last Emperor, which is about China, but also quite a bit about Japan's role in China in the 20th century, there's a taste of this relationship when the Japanese military were ordering around the Chinese Emperor Puyi, whom they placed as the puppet ruler of Manchuria, or northeast China. However, the Japanese samurai class, their elites, treated their emperor, the Japanese emperor, with great respect since he was thought to be descended from divinity. But that didn't stop them from ignoring him when it was convenient, just like the Japanese army responded to Puyi's efforts to be an independent ruler by walking out on him and taking care of anybody who had sided with him. However, back to Japan, this Japanese samurai class treated their emperor with great respect. As I just said, more on that later. The daimyo sent money and hostages to the shogun because that was the way to maintain peace, avoid an invasion by an angry daimyo, not have the roof cave in. However, that threat waxed and waned, depending on the military prowess and personality, and I suppose not the least the testosterone level of the shogun himself. If you stop and think about it, somebody who is bookish, who is not inclined toward violence, who is not particularly astute at handling a sword or a spear, would be less likely probably to enthusiastically order the invasion of a rude daimyo than somebody who was quite astute at those skills. Anyway, I don't want to get too much into that. The Tokugawa shoguns were all one family line, and that Tokugawa, that's a name, that's a family name. And like any lineage, as I've been trying to say, there were strong and weak descendants. In the Gordon reading, there's a section on the daimyo that begins on page 14. It underlines the difference between the reliable and loyal Fudai daimyo, who were the local rulers again, and others who needed to be watched and kept in line. Go on to slide 5 now. So just briefly, I want to make sure you understand that Japan and China have been at it with each other over the great land bridge of the Korean Peninsula for a long time. China tried invading Japan about 1,000 years ago through Korea, and in the 1590s, Hideyoshi Toyotomi, the great daimyo who appeared to be about to ascend to the shogunate, did the same thing, but he lost that gamble when the Ming dynasty of China intervened by crossing the Yalu River, just as centuries later the communist regime under Mao Zedong would cross the Yalu River to drive back the U.S. Marines and others in a massive counterattack. After Hideyoshi's death during this conflict, Tokugawa Ieyasu, his rival, won a great battle, the Battle of Sekigahara, and took control of Edo and also Tokyo, far to the south, where the emperor resided. Go on to slide 6. So the legacy of these wars with China over Korea, between China and Japan over Korea, was long-lasting. Many Japanese thinkers considered Korea to be within Japan's sphere of influence, while Chinese strategists and others thought the opposite. You'll see a Stratfor video about this. It's titled "The Interests." Now I can't remember the exact title of North Korea. It's in the syllabus. You'll find it. I think you learned a couple weeks ago that the officials who were the elite in Korea had to pass through a Chinese-style examination system, Confucian examination system, to be able to write essays in the so-called 8-legged style, etc., etc. We'll learn more about that as we get into China. And they were steeped in the Confucian classics on how to properly govern. And so, also, were the Japanese elites. Their eventual shift away from Chinese thought during the challenge of the West after 1853 was a vital change. However, it did not precipitate the drive to take over Korea. That was based on simple geopolitics. And when I say that, I'm talking about the drive to take over Korea that began in the 1870s and continued until they finally pulled it off. First step being the landings in Korea in the 1870s, followed by gradual I'm sorry, the vocabulary has failed me all of a sudden. Gradual intervention during the 80s, and war with China over the Korean Peninsula in 1894 to 95, the Sino-Japanese War. And finally, beating back the Russians and winning the war against them in 1904 to 05, when Japan completely took over Korea. If China controls all of Korea, then that's a potential threat to Japan, and vice versa. Japanese power was ascendant, and so they knew that they could push other powers out of Korea, and therefore lower the risk of invasion of Japan. Again, I'm not making excuses for imperialism here, but I'm simply observing the obvious, that quite often when countries take the road of imperialism, they are doing so because they think they need to do it. Their leaders think they need to do this in order to guarantee national survival. As Russian power, of course, moved into this region in the late 19th century, this is what complicated the equation and brought them into the picture. Since the end of World War II, the Americans have also weighed in, as we will see in subsequent weeks. This leaves the Koreans in 3 basic camps. This is a very rough statement. There's no nuance here. Camp number 1, some people are completely anti-foreign. Camp number 2, some people carefully assess history and the current situation in order to play off one outsider against the other to maintain independence, very rational. And some are less discerning, and for lack of a better term, go with the flow. That is, they become collaborators over history. There are these people you will read about. As with any other occupied peoples, collaborators find a way. And there are the opposite. There are also the heroes of one stripe or another. Meanwhile, to this day, the surrounding powers are always watching and looking out for what they consider to be a dangerous shift in the status quo that could threaten them. A very touchy situation, one that does not cause me to admire the pickle that Koreans have always been in. Let's go on to slide 7. So speaking of not liking foreigners, back to the main topic. First the Portuguese and then the Dutch had a trading station in Nagasaki in southern Japan, which is shown in this illustration. It was an island, the island of Deshima. You might remember from the week 1 lecture that Deshima was on the map of Portuguese entrepôts in Asia. Just before the closure of Japan, the Portuguese and all other Catholics were thrown out after an uprising was blamed on them by the daimyos of the time. The reaction was to close Japan so that foreigners would instigate no further uprisings, blaming the foreigner, blaming the outsider, blaming the contractor who cleans up after the office is closed for thefts. These are natural and unfortunate and usually wrong reactions. Japan had the equivalent of state-to-state relations then, really not much of an equivalent, only with Korea during this period. And they were taken through the daimyo of Tsushima in the southern part of Japan, who controlled Nagasaki. You've heard, perhaps, if you look at maps, you've heard of the Straits of Tsushima, the Japanese name for the body of water between Japan and Korea. So this Sakoku edict, which means closing the country or closed country, lasted until 1799. But with the decline of Japanese copper and silver mines during the 18th century and the development of Japanese handicraft industries, which took up the market previously served, the domestic market in Japan, previously served by Chinese imports of silk, that trade with China and Korea was reduced to a fraction of its former self during the 1800s. So this decline in natural resources available for mining, except for coal from the north, Japan is now thought of as a place largely without significant natural resources, was very important in the late 19th century, that is the late 1800s, as the country's economy trended toward manufacturing. And with it, the growing need came to maintain maritime trade routes. And of course that would develop after the arrival of Western interests, accompanied by warships, which forced the opening of Japan. So let's start on that topic. Skipping over slide 8, we'll start now talking about resisting those foreigners. On slide 9 now. The class system of Japan in traditional times was important to what followed in the 19th century and influenced how Japanese reacted to the arrival of Western military power in Northeast Asia at mid-century. That is the 1840s and 50s. By 1900, the nation would be transformed into a nation of commoners, as the writer Marius Jansen has put it, transformed into a nation of commoners. But before and after the Meiji Restoration, the samurai, who, although they were stratified within their own class, were placed high above the rest of the population. As time passed and the 19th century arrived, they were more and more, in the words of Marius Jansen again, an underemployed and unproductive elite, and previous class divisions became less important between those major classes as time went on, although they remained present to a degree. The samurai received stipends instead of fiefs under the daimyo, that is, big portions of land. They were practically above the law in their domains as long as they behaved themselves and did what they were told. Their fixed stipends, however, which continued after the Meiji Restoration in 1868, became an issue. Gradually, they were an armed class without any real use, whose incomes were shrinking in worth, and they were, of course, increasingly resentful of their lowered status. But they still had their swords, which contributed to the violent atmosphere that followed. As for the peasantry, peasants are always in a pickle. Their villages were taxed as a unit, and 5 family units in villages were grouped together for surveillance and mutual responsibility, similar to system in China called the Baojia system, the Baojia system. Taxes eventually approached 50% on the peasantry, and this was a contributing factor to various revolts in the 1820s and 30s that actually continued through the 1880s. In the readings, you'll note that political sophistication was growing among both peasants and other common people throughout the 19th century. This eventually contributed to the beginnings of a more homogeneous culture to replace the varied expectations and norms of the fiefdoms, contributing to national integration. Gordon makes the point also, by the way, that the image of the wholly obedient and dedicated Japanese soldier that comes out of World War II is somewhat accurate for that time, but was not all that accurate for preceding periods. There was a lot of dissatisfaction, there were revolts, etc. Dive into those readings and find out more about that. Going on to slide 10. So the increasing importance of this alternate attendance system under the Tokugawa gradually changed the economy by stimulating travel and trade, just as a U.S. economic advantage that we learned about 2 weeks ago has come from its extensive river system and numerous coastal ports. The Japanese had a very good advantage in water transportation because of their long coastlines and many ports. Water transportation, you'll remember, is much cheaper than other forms. So the Japanese economy benefited from cheap coastal transport. Cities grew, and so did population. London was one of the only cities that rivaled Edo in size. Compared to them at the time, and I'm speaking now about the early 19th century, New York City in the early years of the U.S. was a suburb, and Boston was a provincial nothing. Going on to slide 11. However, historical developments are seldom linear and happily progressive. The Gordon reading has a good description of the developments in the late 18th century that interrupted Japan's economic and population growth. A cold snap, a population decline, disease, famine, many problems that caused samurai to complain that the rulers' moral failings were causing these declines. Let's go on to slide 12. So the establishment, we have to say, had a lot left in them in the last decades of the shoguns. These developments that we've been talking about took decades and decades. We have to pay attention to these dates as you go. Remember that these changes were not very fast. Reforms of a sort were pursued in 1790 by an important intellectual samurai named Matsudaira, who's listed on this slide. Such figures have pigeon perches all over Japan, just like Teddy Roosevelt and Abe Lincoln are featured in places like the park blocks all over America. Matsudaira's reforms helped but did not forestall problems that we will discuss a few slides hence. Perhaps because the Kansei reforms were intended to revamp Confucian-style government, they were not really intended to modernize Japan's administration and military in order to meet a Western threat, as were the Meiji reforms. So the Kansei reforms did not prevent internal unrest, much less arm Japan to face these hitherto unimagined threats. We'll stop this audio here and continue with slide 13.